This is number 4 in our reflections on T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday. One thing to note as we're going through Ash Wednesday, T.S. Eliot lives in the tension between silence, stillness, what can be heard by being still, and the place for words and speech and metaphor. Eliot is very suspicious of the world of what Hamlet would call words, words, words. And in his poetry, he tries to evoke, to alert people to the fact that there's levels of reality that we're often not even aware of if we're only fixated on excessive intellectualism, excessive speech, excessive activism. There's so much we simply are unaware of because of a simplistic, one-dimensional, reductionistic sort of way of knowing in that sense. And so Eliot in Ash Wednesday is alerting, he's calling forth, he's summoning a way of knowing and being that in our frantic West that we often are acutely unaware of, and in doing so much is concealed from us on our journey. And Ash Wednesday, in that sense, as a forerunner of 4 quartets, is a fine portal into what that way of knowing is and what it means. Ash Wednesday, like 4 quartets, it often hasn't been studied as manifestos of formation of the soul, the mind, the imagination, the longings, the thirst for meaning. But in fact, that's what it is in many ways. They're both texts. Ash Wednesday is a primer, in some ways, to 4 quartets of what it means to know oneself, what it means to be acutely aware of indulging certain appetites that lead to restlessness and a lack of meaning, and then the frantic nature of grasping again for meaning. So what's the nature then, and what is Eliot getting at in part 4 of the 4 quartets? Let me walk with you through varied lines and then brief reflections on them. He begins section 4, who walked between the violet and the violet? Why the violet? The violet is the color, which is the flower of dusk, the season between day where there is light and night where there is darkness. So who walks between that, and what can they illuminate for us on our journey? So who walked between the violets and the violet? Who walked between the various ranks of varied green? Green is the color of fecundity, of life, and the various types of fertility in life. But who walks and understands that world? The world of the dusk, the world of life, the world of light, but also in the midst of that season between day and dark. Going in white and blue, in Mary's color, white, as we looked at previously, is the color of integrity, authenticity, purity. Blue is the color of eternity, the color of the ultimate, the color of spirituality. I was at the monastery this past weekend, Westminster Abbey mission, and in my room, very simple, ascetic room, was an icon of Mary, Mary dressed in blue. Blue is the eternal color. And she's talking of trivial things. So when a person is living in this world, they're not living in a world of perfection, absolute clarity. They're not living in a world in which they're absorbed in an unhealthy realism and indulgence. But they're willing to talk of trivial things with people, regardless of where they are in their season of life, where they are in their journey. Talking of trivial things. In ignorance, we both see and we do not see. So whoever is doing this walking is an icon of sorts, in ignorance and in knowledge of eternal dolor. And of course, when we get the eternal dolor, we're back to the issue of distress and anxiety. And this is the dusk season. But this person walks in this, both sharing the blue, the white of Mary's color, but also you have the dusk. You have the eternal dolor, the struggle to understand in the midst of unknowing, the midst of uncertainty, the midst of unclarity. It was very interesting when I was at the monastery, when we woke up in the morning, up on the hill, the magnificent expanse of the blue sky was above us, but just below us, there was this total sea of clouds. in which we could not see into the green valley below. And so in this particular section, and what Eliot is getting at, how do we live in the two? How do we live in the world which is beneath the cloud in all of its storm and drang, all of its challenges, all of its ignorance, all of its knowledge, all of its trivial things? The one who walks in that world knows how to internalize and live in that complex world, who moved among the others as they walked. So she is silently there, walking amongst them. Again, there's not a lot of speech here. It's just the walking, it's being present, and this will be very important to Eliot as we move into the next section, the notion of the logos, of the word, the presence of that which is. So this is one who walks among others as they walked. So speech is marginalized. It's just someone who is present, who walks among people in the trivial and ignorance and knowledge in the dusk between the violets of eternal dolor. It's this type of walking and being present with people who then made strong the fountain, because often the fountain can be dry, but it's the presence of someone who is truly there for others in the ambiguities and uncertainties of life, who makes the fountain strong and made fresh the springs. So they bring life, they bring water to slake the thirst of people's souls on their journey. So who is this person? They also make cool the dry rock. Now we're into the metaphor of the desert, and anyone who's hiked or trekked in desert regions, rocks by midday can be scorchingly hot. You certainly don't sit on them. But this person who walks, who makes cool the dry rock and made the sand firm, or firm the sand. Anyone who's walked in dunes, deserts, know the sand can be very, very much difficult to walk on as it disappears or threads out beneath your feet. It's not stable, it's not predictable. But this person who does the walking in their presence, not saying anything at all, there is no speech, there is no words, but they make the sand firm. And so they, as it were, in the desert, the rock is a place that is not scorchingly hot and the sand is firm, so the walking can take place in the desert places. And she's in blue again. We're in the blue of Mary, the blue of eternity, in blue of larkspur, blue of Mary's color, Sovigna vos, which of course Eliot is drawing right from Dante, which is be mindful, be aware, be alert, remember. This is a form of presence that very few people embody in their life. And you sort of tapping a key on the piano and saying, be aware of this, slow down, stop in the process. Being present to life, to people, is really what the journey is about. Not all talk, words, thinking. It's being present to another, soul to soul, heart to heart, mind to mind. And it's be mindful of that, because that's where real transformation occurs. So then he moves on. Here are the years that walk between. Always in Eliot, you're between one thing and another. We're not in the world of pure ideas, but beware of being immersed in the world of pure realism, where there's cynicism and skepticism and a sense of futility. And walking between these worlds, living in the tension, we see this develop very much in section 2, of course. Here are the years that walk between. Hearing, are bearing away the fiddles and the flutes, restoring. This is very important in this section. Much is being restored through those who are present to themselves. They are present to others. Restoring, one who moves in the time between sleep and waking. In our journey through time, we are often sleeping. We're in slumber. Many great fairy tales talk about kissing others into wakefulness. But we sleep, but we're between this world of the soul, not quite awake, longing to awake, but how does it awake? But this one moves in the time between sleep and waking, wearing white light folded. And so there is this white, again, we're back to white, but it's light, the light of whiteness itself. She's sheathed about her, folded, the New Year's walk. So bringing into actually life, new years, new life, a new way of being, restoring through a bright cloud of tears. Here we're back into suffering, the tragic, but in that, life, restoration, the new year's emerging. So it's never a naive optimism. Neither is it a paralyzing cynicism or skepticism. There's living in this tension between suffering and hope, which is wary of naive optimism on the one hand and an impotent cynicism on the other hand, through the bright cloud of tears. So we often don't think of tears in a bright cloud, but again, you have Eliot merging these, synthesizing these two metaphors. The years restoring. And this is very interesting because one would think with Ash Wednesday, Lent, leading towards Easter, that there would be some discussion of Jesus, of Christ, which is so central to the major cycle of the church. Yet the dilemma, as Eliot was acutely aware, is the language of Jesus as Christ. Those words have become so devalued, so misused, so misinterpreted. They have actually lost meaning for many people. And so they become cheap coinage that is bartered, trucked, and traded by various people, hucksters of religion and much else. So he's trying to get to what is that story that has been so damaged, so misunderstood, so perverted. He's trying to tell the story again in a way that speaks to people's deep longings. So he says, through the bright cloud of tears, the year's restoring, with a new verse. And this is what he actually is doing. He's doing a new verse, the ancient rhyme. So there's a rhyme that's in the soul, it's in life itself. But how do we tell that? How do we bring that to people when in fact that ancient story, that rhyme has been so distorted, polluted in many ways? So with a new verse, that the ancient rhyme, and what it is part of that ancient rhyme is redeem the time, redeem. But if people don't understand the rhyme, if they don't understand what's going on, how do you redeem the time if time itself for many people is pointless, meaningless, or it's just a place of where one indulges conflicting appetites and longings and desires? So redeem the time, redeem, and again he moves back to the unread vision in the higher dream. So not only do we have a new verse, we need the ancient rhyme, but we need to somehow relearn how to the unread vision, which is not read well anymore in the higher dream. So how do we get to reading the actual text that has been scribbled over, it's been erased, it's been distorted, it's been problematically interpreted and applied? Eliot's trying to point the way, and this is why he doesn't use a lot, doesn't use at all, in fact, the language of Jesus and Christ, because it has been so perverted, distorted to serve all sorts of problematic interests, both within religious communities and outside of religious communities, whether it's for war, entrepreneurial interests, hucksters in religion who use the language of Christianity, Jesus Christ. He just doesn't want to go there anymore because he realizes for thoughtful people, the language means nothing. So how do we get to that story, but tell it in a way that speaks again in a fresh way? So the unread vision in the higher dream, well, jeweled unicorns, and of course the unicorn is the symbol of purity. The jeweled unicorns draw by the gilded hearse. So here you have the hearse of that which is dead, a language which is dead. It's gilded, it's prettied up on the outside, but in fact it's dead inside. And so the jeweled unicorn of eternity, it draws the gilded hearse, drawing it away from that which produces not the life of the unicorn anymore, but there's a deadness in a certain type of religion and spirituality does not speak to people. And the jeweled unicorn is pulling it, the gilded hearse, all pretty and attractive, seemingly on the outside, but Hamlet says seems. It's actually death inside the hearse. So the silent sister, and again, we're into silence again. And the question which begins is, who does this? It's the silent sister, veiled in white and blue. And again, she's silent. It's the colors that speak, just as in a liturgical service. There's the speech in the liturgy, but what's the speech of the colors, of the vestments, and the crook and the mitre and the whole nature, what goes on of color itself and the movements within a liturgy. As I mentioned earlier, I was at the monastery this past weekend, and the liturgy would begin in the Psalter or something else, and then you'd almost have 5 minutes of silence to meditate on the speech of what has been said in the antiphonal chants of the monks in the choral stalls. So the silent sister, veiled in blue and white again, there's presence, there's integrity, there's someone who is there, who's lived through the dusk, the dolor, the hard, the painful, the suffering, but she's there between the yews. The yew is the tree, the evergreen tree, first of all, that is evergreen in the midst of the varied seasons of life. So it's between the yews. It's also death and resurrection. The yew is a very important tree for the Celtic tradition as well. So she's between the yews, between the death, the resurrection, between evergreening when all is dead. As well. How does that take place? Behind the garden God, we'll hear the world of the Pan and fertility and nature. And so it's even behind the garden God, even the worlds we create, our gardens in our soul and our physical world, it's even behind that. So what lingers and lurks behind even our creations, our constructions, whose flute is breathless. So the flute here is not, there's no sound coming out, it's breathless. And whose flute has bent her head silently again. So where the flute is not making the sound, you're back of the garden God, you're between the yews. She bends her head silently. Again, no speech, no language, no script. The presence is there. So the bending of her head itself is language. What is being said in the quiet bending of the head, the language of that, and signed but spoke no word. So what's she signing, and why does she speak no word? Well, she is speaking a word, but not the words as we understand it of common speech. There's a language going on of metaphors, similes, icons. She is a moving icon in many ways. But in her presence, the fountain sprang up. So here, up from the bottom comes the water, which nourishes. Water is always the sign of life that slakes the soul's thirst. So from above, the mountain springs up. The lingering metaphor in this is the desert. So in the desert, the fountain will spring up. And from above, what you've got, the birds sang down. So you got from eternity into time, and time intersecting with eternity, the fountain and the bird coming together. So you have the language of the bird, of song. At this time of year, we're March, April, we're entering spring. We're getting the return, of course, of birds in the spring season. And so what Eliot is bringing these two once again together. But the fountain sprang up and the birds sang down, redeem the time. So in the midst of the human journey, what does it mean for each of us to redeem the time, to bring in meaning in the time that we have? Redeem the dream. So this again, we go back earlier to the unread vision in the higher dream. So how do we bring the higher dream, or as it were, the ancient rhyme into time? Redeem the time, redeem the dream, the token of the word unheard. So this lady, the silent lady, she actually is a portal, a pointer, an inukshuk in that way, of the word unheard, which of course we're going to move into in section 5. Eliot again and again, we'll get this in 4 quartets, where actually it starts with quotes from key pre-Socratic thinker of the Logos. And so rather than using the language of Jesus and Christ, we're moving back to John again, the eagle, of which the Logos is very, very important. And so the word seems to be unheard. So the token, but she's a token of the word unheard. And yet there is speech in her presencing of herself. And it's unspoken. And so as we move into number 5, we'll see that in fact, how the Logos penetrates time, engages time, and how are we sensitive to the presencing of the presence of that which is present. And until the wind shakes 1,000 whispers from the yew. So the yew, the evergreen, here the wind, of course, is the symbol in John of the Spirit. So here you have the word unheard, the logos. We have the wind whispering to the yew, which is the symbol of death and resurrection, the symbol of greenness in the desert. And after this, our exile. So what does it mean to live in our exile in a culture that can draw people into very silly understandings of meaning and purpose? And these things can occur as much in the language of spirituality, much in the world of the church. How do we live and understand what it means to be our exile between we are not purely beings of time, but we're not only beings of eternity itself. And so we live in exile, attempting to find our way forward. And section 4, in that sense, opens up for us paths in what it means to be present to that which is present and presencing itself, which opens up for us then section 5, where Eliot moves into the notion of the logos, or the capital word, smaller w word, and then what that means in terms of formation and the dynamic relationship between various forms of speech that come our way, but how are we to be attentive and attuned to those various messages coming to us? And if we're not attentive, we just miss a multiplicity of the messages which the Logos and the Silent Lady and Mary brings us, if our soul is not properly in its appropriate place of attunement and listening and stillness.